Before I get started, I want to do a little audience survey. How many people in here work for a daily newspaper that has a Sunday edition? Okay. How many work for a daily that does not have a Sunday? How many work for a 3 times a week newspaper? Twice a week? Once a week? We've got a really broad spectrum audience here, and a lot of the things I talk about will be more geared toward the smaller side of that spectrum. But there's a lot of concerns, and sometimes the size of a community can be a relative thing. I covered politics largely for a major metropolitan newspaper, but I also did it for weekly newspapers, and I was lucky to work for a publisher who wanted us to cover politics like, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, wanted us to cover local politics, the courthouse, like it was the state capitol. Now, the practical difficulty in that is the fundamental problem, fundamental challenge in community journalism is dealing with the conflict that exists between the personal and the professional. You know, you want to have friends. You want to be liked. And sometimes you have to do things that make you not liked. And managing that conflict is the secret to success in community journalism, I think. So when it comes to covering politics, you got to be friends with all factions. They have to understand that you're playing an institutional role, that you'll do your best to treat everybody fairly and even-handedly, that you will make mistakes, but that's because you're a human being. I think doing personality features about people in public life can be very helpful. If you've got somebody who is somewhat wary of you, do a feature about them. You know, the original definition of the word interview was a conversation between two people. You get to know something about this person, they get to know something about you. That can be very helpful. And while you do need to have kind of a hard nose about this, you don't need to be pugnacious or defensive about it. It's business. You're just taking care of business. You're serving the public. That's your business as a journalist. And you've got to look for opportunities to make connections and show understanding. Here's an example. I was very early in my career as a political journalist. I was covering the county of Logan, just west of Bowling Green in southern Kentucky. Our publisher was a strong advocate of school consolidation and higher taxes for education. The school board was not an advocate of such things, and there was a continuing conflict between that school board and our newspaper. So the board did a little trick. They put a tax for consolidation on the ballot so that people would defeat it. And they did. And at the school board meeting after the election, the agenda was short, and they sort of began talking amongst themselves very informally. And they told this wonderful story. Somebody asked about the referendum question, and the election officer says, "You don't want no more damn tax, do you?" That person voted against the tax. And they essentially acknowledged in this conversation that they put this thing on the ballot in order to get it defeated. But I also was able to describe this conversation in very personal terms, to describe these school board members as persons, as human beings. A welcome respite for the men who have been embroiled in controversy for the last few months. There's just a little hint of sympathy or empathy in that. You've got to be able to show that and look for opportunities to do it. Okay, we don't want to treat it clinically. We've had a lot of talk here about Q&As and issue stories, but you've got to humanize political coverage. At the same time, you've got to cover it like you have the ultimate responsibility, the primary responsibility for helping your readers, listeners, and viewers make informed choices. That's the heart of political coverage. I think it really helps sometimes to pull back the official curtain. You know, sometimes we put people in a frame that is their title. County Judge Executive or County Republican Chairman, whatever. you've got to pull back the curtain and talk about the political and personal connections between people, both at the local level and at the state level. How many of you here know who's your local county contact person for state patronage? Almost every state has a patronage system. Some states it's stronger than others, but the governor always has a local contact person whom he consults or she consults about who gets jobs or appointments or contracts or favors in that county. And sometimes, who gets a knife in their back. You need to know who that person is. And you need to write a story about it. Sometimes they operate in the shadows. This is a story we did in Logan County after the governorship changed. Governor got elected to the Senate, leaving the lieutenant governor as governor, and they had different friends in Logan County. So we did a story about just how the patronage was going to be handled. This is a column that the publisher wrote. I also wrote a story on this subject. You've got to write about the personalities and their personal connections, because sometimes they can have public policy impact. On the same page, this is election night. These are human beings having a good time. This is the county clerk getting the final results in, or confirming some result with a precinct person. Doing stuff like that really humanizes political coverage, and it frankly pleases the objects of that coverage when you can show them in a frame that is friendly. Our newspaper endorsed. We had a publisher who was active in politics. He believed that it was the newspaper's responsibility to give readers his best judgment about who ought to serve in state office, not in local office. My theory is, I never really asked him about this, but my theory is that he only wanted to make so many people mad. You start endorsing in local races, there's lots of cross currents that come into play, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But you can see we endorsed for governor, lieutenant governor, and state representative. That's as low on the ballot as we went. Those were the primary endorsements. These are the general election endorsements. There was no endorsement for state representative in the general because the primary was dispositive. Do you want to endorse or don't you? 90% of daily newspapers do political endorsements of some kind. Most weeklies do not. That's not surprising. Generally, the smaller the paper, the less likely it is to endorse. We did a study of this. It's hard to see. I'll move out of the way. These are daily newspapers in Kentucky. They're endorsement policies. You can see we go down the ballot from national to state legislative, and then to local. And I have a copy of the research paper that we did on endorsements and editorial leadership, if you want to see that. Why don't people endorse? Well, there's risk, and there's questions of resources, and there's questions about relationships. The risk can be both personal and business. You're doing one of the most aggressive things that a newspaper can do if you choose to endorse candidates. That can make enemies. Resources, it takes time to do it right. You don't want to do an endorsement just on your actual, your current knowledge. You want to do a little more research and say, do I really feel confident in endorsing this person over this other person or these other people for this office? And then there's the relationships. It's just not comfortable for a lot of people to get into the endorsement business. Some races are just too close for comfort. And I think that's another reason that at the Logan Leader News Democrat in Russellville, Kentucky, we did not endorse in local races. But the primary reason was we felt like in a county of 18,000 people, most voters had the opportunity to have personal knowledge of these candidates. They didn't really need the newspaper's help as much as you would in a larger community. So some of these races are too close for comfort, but they're where you can have the most impact. Here's a little research. Endorsements are most effective in local, nonpartisan elections where the candidates are unfamiliar, the ballot's long and complicated, or voters have received conflicting information. Judicial races are particularly prone to these kinds of problems because judicial candidates aren't supposed to make promises about how they're going to rule. But there's a lot in lawyers' backgrounds that give some indication about whether or not they'd be a good judge or not. And I have a story about that at the end. The arguments for endorsement are, you know the people and the issues, probably better than anybody else except the participants themselves, or at least you should. You're in a unique position to inform and advance the debate. And editorials can really separate the wheat from the chaff in a way that news stories cannot. You know, news stories have to be scrupulously even-handed, sometimes being fair and balanced doesn't mean it's 50-50. You know, sometimes the other side just has a lot better arguments, but you have to be careful about that in news stories. In editorials, you don't have to be. The arguments against, it may cast a shadow on your news coverage. You've got to be careful about maintaining public confidence in your product. People already know the candidates. If it's a small community, you may not have the need or feel the need. Folks at the newspaper sure know the candidates. Here's a quote from the publisher of the Bowling Green Daily News on why he doesn't endorse. His friends at church or Rotary or whatever. But the phrase smaller town raises a question. Just what is a smaller town? Bowling Green is now a town of 50,000 people. When Pipes Gaines said that, it's probably 45,000. In a nearby county in Kentucky of the same size, there's a completely different attitude. This is the News Enterprise in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. It's the only daily newspaper published in Kentucky by Landmark Community Newspapers, which is based in the state. Landmark's a pretty good chain. And they got a new editor in 2002, Warren Wheat, who had worked at USA Today and The State in Columbia, South Carolina, other major papers. This was Warren's last job as a journalist. And he meant to leave a mark. He wanted to bring the News Enterprise up in class, to have it be more of a force in the community. And he decided that the News Enterprise was going to start endorsing candidates for local office. Landmark gives its papers local autonomy. They can endorse or not endorse. Hardin County is where Fort Knox is located. There's the post town of Fort Knox, Radcliffe, which now has about 22,000 people. The county seat, Elizabethtown, has 22,000 people. The county as a whole has almost 100,000 people. That is too big a county to expect most people to have personal knowledge of candidates. The newspaper has to step in and play an aggressive role. So when they started endorsing, Warren got some pushback. He said a couple of women in the grocery store talked a little loud about that new editor and how he was, making people mad. Warren didn't care. He was glad people were paying attention. He explained how he went about this. This is the top of the page on which the first endorsement appeared. He gave priority to explaining what was going on. And then you see the endorsements. They have moved on now from the top local office on the ballot to endorsing in every single local race where there's a truly contested election. And one interesting aspect of the News Enterprise is public members of the editorial board. This is a rotating position. They bring in members of the public to give another perspective, to leaven the viewpoints that, a newspaper can be an echo chamber. It helps to bring in outside views. And I also like the idea of involving people in other departments of the paper. Maybe not in a formal way, because you want to keep that separation between news and business, but people in advertising and business and circulation, they're really in touch with the community too, and they can add good perspectives. If you don't want to endorse, you can write columns. They can provide an alternative short of an endorsement. You can, sort of lean one way or the other without coming right down and saying, we endorse Joe Blow. And editorials can do the same thing. They can analyze and offer perspective that is short of an endorsement. But you have to be careful about this. In my first job as a weekly newspaper editor, I arrived in the county next to mine. There was a big race going on for circuit judge, and the incumbent circuit judge was running against the former circuit judge effectively. His actual opponent was that former circuit judge's brother. And his campaign was all about how he had changed things in the last 6 years from the guy who had the judgeship before. He'd never said anything about his actual opponent. So I wrote an editorial that said, in these judicial races, it's hard to separate candidates from the other because they can't make promises, but maybe the kind of campaigns they run indicate the kind of judge they will be. I was clearly leaning in the direction of the challenger because I didn't like how the circuit judge was conducting his campaign. Well, when I wrote that editorial, I completely forgot, or maybe made myself forget, the fact that my father had political connections with the challenger. My motives were immediately questioned, and the circuit judge goes on the radio, buys a 6-minute ad in which he castigates me and our newspaper, which was the second newspaper in a one-newspaper town. What was I going to do? Well, I'd been in radio before. I went and bought a 30-second ad and said, we're just trying to help people cast an informed vote. The circuit judge lost. So while I won that battle, I didn't win the overall battle. I closed the newspaper about 3 months later. But this gets back to one of the problems you have in small towns. If you grew up in the town in which you're doing your coverage, people are always going to question what sort of family or business or church or other connections you may have with candidates. So play it straight and be self-aware.